Hi, everybody. So far in our houses, we've been building and designing what we want it to look like. Now we're going to worry about how to put it together. This is our first jump into structure, and I want to start at the bottom with our foundation and work our way up. Obviously, this isn't all the structure for a home, but this is certainly some of it. So let's get started. Down here is our first structural member. It's called the footer. The footer spreads the weight of the house out over a larger area. Footer size is based on the weight of the house as well as the ground that it sits on. The worse the ground is, the bigger the footer. The more weight of the house, the bigger the footer. The next member that we look at is the foundation wall. The foundation wall goes from the footer all the way up to above the ground. And attached to the foundation wall is our first wooden member right here. This is called the sill. Some people call it a mud sill. I don't know why, but you don't want mud on your sill. The sill is held to the house with sill bolts. Those sill bolts don't hold this down to the foundation. They hold the sill from sliding on the foundation. So if we get a big windstorm, we can actually blow a house off its foundation. And the sill bolts prevent that. If I come over here to the inside of my house, we'll see this. Now this first wooden member that's here, and again, I'll see it over here, is a solid member. As you can see, it goes all the way across, and it actually wraps around the entire building. So as you can see, it goes all the way around the building. That's called a ribbon joist. I've heard it called a header before because it heads off our floor joists. And our floor joists are these pieces right here. These pieces hold up our subfloor, and this is really what we walk on. The floor joists are attached to the ribbon joist. They're also attached to the sill. And as we look at these, the floor joist typically is not long enough to go the full width of our house. So we have to put in a beam. And this beam is really important. In this structure, this beam handles a third of the weight of the building. A third of it goes here on the foundation wall, a third ends up here on the beam, and the other third ends up on this foundation wall. So as you can see, there's lots of structure that happens here. But what's weird about this beam is this beam, which is a built-up beam, it's a standard beam, just like our floor joists are standard beams in this design. They don't have to be, and we'll get to that at a later date. But this beam is made up of 4 pieces laminated together, and that's going to be held up by another structural member, which I'll show you in a second. Before I get into that, though, our floor joists, as I said earlier, don't go from one side of the house to the other. They have to be held up because they're not long enough. We can buy a 2x12 or a 2x10, which is a typical floor joist material, and we can only get them at 16 feet lengths. We can pay extra to get them to 20-foot length, but that's a lot of extra money. And there are alternatives to a standard piece of lumber for a floor joist, which we'll go over at a later time. The other thing to know about a floor joist is that their spacing. These floor joists are spaced on a model of 16 inches on center, which means if I go from the center of one to the center of the next one, it'll be 16 inches. Sometimes floor joists are placed at 1 foot on center, but typically there are 16 inches on center. Our beam, as I said before, holds up the end of the floor joists so they don't fall into the basement. And if I go down into my basement, I will see a steel column. This steel column holds up my beam or my girder and prevents it from sagging and letting the house fall into the basement. This column is called a lally column, and as you can see, I have 2. Now, lally column is spelled Lally. It's not a lolly column like a lollipop. It's a lally column. And that lally column sits on the floor. But it can't just sit on the floor because the weight of the house going through the beam, through the lally column, would push the lally column through our thin little floor. So what we need is an additional footer. And this is called a lally column footer. And that gives extra strength and extra structure so that this lally column doesn't push its way through the floor. So as I zoom back out, just to quickly review, I can see that I have a footer, which is the bottom member, my foundation wall. The first wooden member on my foundation is the sill, which is held down by sill bolts. The next piece we put on is my ribbon joist. That ribbon joist goes all the way around the house. Remember, that could also be called a header. I've always known it as a ribbon joist. That's how I was taught. The floor joists hold up our subfloor, which eventually our floor would go on, and this is where we'd walk. Our girder or our beam holds up the end of our floor joists so that we don't have to have floor joists to go from one side of the house to the other, although there are benefits to that, and we'll go over that at a later time. Our beam, which in this case is a laminated beam, 4 pieces, is held up by our lally columns, which sits on our floor, which in turn is held up by a lally column footer. And these, remember, are only underneath our alley columns. I hope that helps you understand a little bit about the structure of your home. And if you want, and you have a foundation at home, or a basement at home, I should say, go down in your basement, start looking for things. You will see the lally column. You'll see the foundation wall. If you get kind of work your way up towards the ceiling, you will find that sill. You will also see your floor joists. If we work our way down into our basement, we'll see our floor joists. And you may even see the beam or girder. So I hope that helps, and hope you get a chance to look in your basement and see how that all looks and how it feels. I hope this helps, and let me know if you have questions, comments, concerns, or violent disagreements.